So thank you everybody for coming to this really, really exciting event. Can Truth Survive the New Journalism? We're joined by some really incredible distinguished guests to tackle this really important, burning, big picture question. And the reason that we've kind of brought this question up on the fourth dropping of Free Speech Champions is because journalism is going for a big kind of deep change in terms of what it's going to be, all of the different forces that are shaping it, whether that's social media, to the kind of rise of the new media, and the way in which kind of some people have argued that journalism, which was originally argued to be for the fearless pursuit of truth and kind of looking at a range of different perspectives and challenging and exposing power, is increasingly moving towards a more kind of partisan, ideological form of journalism, which prioritizes agenda setting over rigorous investigation and reporting. And we've seen lots of kind of big stories that seems to have illuminated this trend, whether that was kind of Piers Morgan recently arguably being sacked from ITV for questioning a claim of a member of the royal family, to Ian Murray, who was the former director for the Society of Editors in the UK, resigned due to pressure after he defended his institution against claims that it was institutionally racist. These are some of the kind of questions and things that we really want to grapple with in this discussion, in this debate. And so to what extent has journalism changed? Some people have argued that, for example, it's always been due to the interests of the kind of press barons or the perspectives of the kind of broadcasters and their funders, and that it hasn't actually really changed. And we're seeing a kind of new manifestation of the same thing. And so there's many different layers to this discussion, whether that's the economic question to free speech and cancel culture. The big question ultimately is, what can a young, free-thinking, independent journalists do to pursue their craft? Where is the best vehicle and venue for them to be able to do that? And so we are joined by some really incredible speakers. Our first speaker is Helen Lewis, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic. She's also the author of Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights. And she's also the former deputy editor of The New Statesman and has written for The Guardian and The Sunday Times. We're also joined by Cade Herzog, who is a journalist, former staff writer at The Stranger, and also co-host of a very famous podcast called Blocked and Reported with Jesse Singal. We're also joined by Bari Weiss, who is an editor and writer, former op-ed editor of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and she's now writing on Substack with many really interesting discussions and questions that she's grappling with on there. And finally, we're also joined by Mick Hume, who is the columnist at Spiked. He was also the launch editor for Spiked and editor of Living Marxism. He has written many books, including There Is No Such Thing as a Free Press, and We Need One Now More Than Ever. And also, trigger warning is the fear of being offensive, killing free speech. And so before we get started, I just want to give some house rules. Please feel free to ask lots of questions, comment, exchange ideas in the chat box. If you would like to ask a question, you need to raise your hand, use the raise hand function, and I will select you. And please keep your answers short and sweet, no monologues, no 5-minute monologues. And I will take multiple questions at a time, and we will hopefully be able to get around to your question. And it will start off with 5 minutes kind of outlining their perspectives and to the question from each of the speakers. Then about 15-20 minutes where I will ask the speakers some of the questions and we'll kind of debate amongst ourselves. And then the remaining 45 minutes we'll be taking questions from the audience. And obviously the Free Speech Champions project is primarily about engaging young people with the questions around free speech and the big picture subjects of today. And it is run 100% by donations. So please consider donating to the project so we can continue getting young people, particularly school students and university students, inspired and engaged about these questions. And so yes, enough from me. I would really like to hear firstly from our first speaker, and that is Helen Lewis. Please share with us your thoughts.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me. Hold on, let me just get my chat, put the chat down so I can't see you being rude about me even as I'm speaking. I expect that tonight we're going to talk a little bit about social media mobs and about cancel culture, however you define that, which I think are both incredibly valid topics, but I do want to situate that discussion within a broader context about journalism now. The biggest threat to journalism right now is that reporting costs money. It's pretty much as simple as that for me. Submitting freedom of information requests costs money. Attending court cases costs money. Talking to people costs money. It is skilled work, and it is work that costs money. It's labor-intensive work. And often the most obvious reward for doing that reporting is that the findings that you have established become the subject of a huge amount of debate by other people who are relying on your work, and they make money out of it, but maybe you've been doing a loss leader. So also there are a lot of corporations and individuals who are willing to spend large amounts of money ensuring that we don't get to the truth. So a very obvious example, look at Purdue Pharmaceuticals. It's been 20 years since they knew that OxyContin, their pain drug, was being abused. Why has it taken so long for that to come out, for people to hold that against them, for American court hearings against them? Because they are billionaires and they have been using their money to obscure the truth. Look at a company like Theranos, which was a multi-million-dollar company promising diagnostic tests with a single drop of blood. It would have been an absolute revolution in medicine if it hadn't all been complete bollocks, which it took one fearless reporter and a huge amount of time and effort and frankly, like libel aversion and the backing of a big newsroom in order to bust that wide open, that was all just a complete con. Look at Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, which recently came out. It reported on the oligarchs who've recently carved up Russia's vast mineral wealth between them. She's being sued for libel, not the publishers, her personally. She's being sued for libel in the English courts, which are very claimant friendly. That is a clear example of billionaires who simply want to make it too expensive to report on what they're doing. Look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, forcing a university out of the country for being too Western. Look at the Chinese Communist Party preventing journalists, outside journalists, from accessing Xinjiang to report on the genocide against the Uyghurs there. Look at local newspapers in both America and Britain, which can't hold local politicians to account because they've been hollowed out by asset strippers. Look at the way that advertising revenue, which was once the lifeblood of both local and national papers, has moved to Google and Facebook. So yeah, I hate being ostracized for holding perfectly mainstream views as much as the next panelist, but that is only one part of the picture here. I'm not going to be killed for my views. I'm probably not even going to be bankrupted for my views. And the reason we need journalism isn't because of some abstract concept of truth, but because without journalism, people, often very rich people, do bad stuff and get away with it. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, but in today's media ecosystem, who can afford to establish the facts?
Thank you, Helen. Lots of really interesting things you've touched upon that we hopefully can get deeper. And Katie, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you all. First of all, thanks everyone for coming here, and thanks for the invitation. It's really an honor to join you all. I'm going to briefly tell you my origin story because it'll explain where I'm coming from and hopefully give the audience some insight into one small piece of what's happening in journalism right now. 4 years ago, I was a completely unknown writer freelancing for a Seattle alt weekly called The Stranger. One of my first pieces for the paper was called The Detransitioners, and it was about a small community of people who had transitioned from one gender to the other and then transitioned back. This was not an opinion piece. It was deeply reported, thoroughly fact-checked, and it was vetted by trans readers before publication. It was the type of piece that just a few years earlier would have been published without controversy, especially at The Stranger, a paper that was known for being provocative. That really was what made the paper special. And while The Stranger published many things over the years I disagreed with, including at one point the addresses of homes in Seattle with yard signs advertising Republican candidates for office, it was always unafraid and unapologetic. Of course, apologies just a few years ago were less in vogue. One thing I found interesting about the detransitioners I interviewed was that they all told me the same thing. Once they detransitioned, they became pariahs within their communities. They were viewed as heretics, which ironically, I would soon learn all about. After the piece came out, there was a huge uproar. In addition to the usual Twitter pile-on in which strangers from all over the world were calling me trash, the backlash went offline. People burned stacks of the paper and sent me videos of it. They made flyers denouncing the piece and put them in newspaper boxes and coffee shops all over Seattle. They even made stickers, and so today, 4 years later, when I walk around Seattle, I see stickers with a photograph of my face and a label that says Nazi sympathizer plastered on stop signs and telephone poles around the city. None of the allegations against me were true, but that didn't matter. And after the piece came out, I was treated as though I were a subversive person. This obviously had a major impact on my life, but ironically, it's largely been good for my career. One of the reasons I have an audience today, one of the reasons I'm here on this panel, is because of the campaign against me. I sometimes think I should send my critics a fruit basket. But personally, I experienced what others have termed a sort of social death. I lost friends I'd had for years. People I knew literally turned their backs on me in the street. I was denounced in public forums by both strangers and friends. I learned something of what the detransitioners I interviewed went through because the same things happened to me. If I were slightly less stubborn, I probably would have quit writing altogether and become an accountant. What happened to me was more dramatic than many cases, but it was not an anomaly. And the reason these stories are important is because when other people, including journalists, see how those of us who stray from party lines are treated, it sends a message. It says, don't write this, don't say that. Editors see this as well, and it impacts what gets published. That piece, The Detransitioners, would not be published by The Stranger today. Still, I'm not arguing that I've been silenced. I haven't been silenced, although I have been censored a few times throughout my career. I am arguing, however, that a free press that is unwilling to tackle difficult issues out of fear is not free at all. And this isn't just bad for our industry, it's bad for society. Of course, in the last few years, we've seen a whole new media ecosystem develop in part as a response to this trend. It's one that harkens back to the heydays of blogging, when independent writers and journalists didn't necessarily need institutions to support them. For many who've been pushed out of traditional journalism, this development has been a godsend. We no longer have to fight to publish on controversial topics or to deal with the cold stares of colleagues who might find our work, to borrow a word, problematic. It's a freeing experience to hit publish on something and know you're not going to get a call from HR. But there's a cost to this as well. Not just because institutions provide support and money and camaraderie, and if you're in the US health insurance, but also because we risk creating ever narrower echo chambers, where consumers support the writers they agree with and don't even have access to those they do not. For readers, this is an obvious problem, skewing their perspective on the world. And for journalists, there's a cost too, because as much as we may hate it, we depend on criticism to act as a check on our own work. If the only people reading my work are people who already agree with me, I gain one kind of check and I lose another. We've seen what echo chambers do to a populace. They create different realities in which my truth and your truth aren't aligned at all. And this can have major and troubling effects, not just on the press, but on all of society. So what are the forces at play here? Unfortunately, there's no one boogeyman we can blame, except maybe the founder of Twitter, and I'm not even sure Jack Dorsey deserves that. Rather, like everything, there's a multitude of forces at play, including economic pressures, technological advances, and human tendencies towards tribalism, social contagion, and moral panic. But no matter the cause, what is becoming abundantly clear is that whatever is happening across the media is also happening in education, in government, in the private and nonprofit sectors. People are scared to speak. I hear from them daily. And this should concern everyone, but especially those of us who fundamentally have one job, and that job is to seek the truth, no matter how difficult or unpopular or how many people would prefer that we don't.
Thank you, Katie. And Bari?
Hard to follow that up. Wonderful to be here with all of you and with Katie and Helen and Mick and an organization that I've been following and admiring for a while. So when I joined the New York Times, the first thing that I did was that I FaceTimed my grandparents, and they cried tears of joy as if I had cured cancer. They were like over the moon that I had this job. Why? Right? I had worked at the Wall Street Journal for years. And I think the reason was beyond the fact that it was like a good brag, at dinner parties with their friends. It was because for their entire lives, they had looked to the New York Times as something like their Bible, much more so than the actual Bible. They felt that it informed them about the world, that it held up a mirror to the world as it was, basically, even with its biases, that it strove for the truth and that it was doing something noble in the world, which was trying to pursue the truth, even when it was inconvenient. So when I left the New York Times this past summer of, my own volition, sort of pre-canceling myself, they were absolutely befuddled by this choice. Like, why the hell would I leave what honestly was, considered one of the best gigs in journalism, not just in America, but in the world. And this is kind of a version of the answer that I gave them that I want to share with you guys. The New York Times is not the New York Times. The New York Times is not the New York Times. Harvard is not Harvard. The New England Journal of Medicine is not the New England Journal of Medicine. These 20th century institutions that I think a lot of us have looked to kind of uphold the liberal order, to be authoritative, they have transformed from within. So while the New York Times has the same font, that is beautiful and has the same lovely website, the content of what it is has fundamentally changed. And it's changed along with economic incentives that Helen mentioned that I think we can get into in the Q&A, I'm hoping. But what this has meant ideologically is that it's kind of undergone what I think of as an ideological revolution from within. the old liberal ideal, right, of reporting the news without fear or favor, of striving for objectivity, even while recognizing, of course, that no one is objective, but striving for it nonetheless. All of those values have given way to something different, something more strident, to a kind of, what has been called a kind of blinding moral clarity, in which stories, news stories or op-eds, videos or podcasts that don't advance a particular narrative, that don't advance what's perceived as the cause of righteousness, of justice, of social justice, of progress, they're seen as something like traitorous. And that meant that the consensus view of sort of what was acceptable and what wasn't as an opinion, what deserved our curiosity and what didn't, that shifted radically even in the 3 years that I spent at the paper. So just to make that a little bit more specific, to give you a little bit more color, the New York Times, in the month before I left, had become a place where an op-ed by a sitting United States Senator, Tom Cotton, that op-ed, 800 employees of the New York Times said that an op-ed by him, that running his op-ed literally put their lives in danger. And that op-ed and the decision to run it pushed my boss, the editorial page editor of the New York Times, out of his job because he was literally putting the lives of people in danger. In the meantime, the New York Times runs op-eds by, terrorist leaders. It runs op-eds calling for abolishing the police. It runs op-eds I remember one by a parent saying that he's not going to let his children have friends to allow his child to be friends with other children of different races. And those kind of pieces are met with hosannas. Now, this shift was a real problem for me because I was hired in this brief period of soul searching that happened after the election of Donald Trump. Everyone will recall that the New York Times, along with a lot of other places, was absolutely shocked by the outcome of this election. And there was a soul searching period in which people at the paper felt, wait, hold on, how did we miss this? And how can we do a better job of showing the world as it is to our readers? And so I was, to be honest with you, a kind of intellectual diversity hire. I went from being, the left-wing squish at the conservative editorial page of the Wall Street Journal to something like the right of Attila the Hun at the New York Times. And my job specifically was to bring in op-eds from people who wouldn't think of the New York Times as their obvious home. Op-eds from heterodox thinkers, from libertarians, for conservatives, from first-time writers, from, dissidents from closed societies. And this shift and this sort of closing of the Overton window meant that I literally couldn't do the job that I was hired to do. And I mean that quite literally. By the end of my time at the paper, we had entered into just imagine this, people who have been involved in journalism or really any consensus-making institution, there was actually editing by consensus in which every single op-ed had to be approved by every single member of the editorial team to make sure that it made them feel comfortable and safe. And you can imagine what that led to. I mean, you can see the results of it at the New York Times today. I would say anyone who's been in a deeply religious environment can imagine what the environment was at the New York Times. Skeptics were treated, let's just say they were not treated kindly. At the New York Times, if you were not woke, if you did not profess to all of the key tenets of whatever we're calling it, wokeism, critical social justice, the successor ideology, the liberal ideology that doesn't really yet have a name, then you were regarded as suspect. And this ideology is a very strange one because it declares that speech is violence, but violence, when it's carried out by the right people in pursuit of a just cause, is not violence at all. In this ideology, bullying is considered wrong unless you're bullying the right people, in which it's considered very, very good. In this ideology, education is not about teaching people how to think. It's about re-educating them. It's about unlearning. In this ideology, and this is really important, the past cannot be understood in its own terms, but it needs to be judged by the morals and mores of the present moment. And I think most importantly for in journalism, skeptics of any part of this ideology, they're recast as heretics. They are tarnished as bigots. They are subjected to boycotts, and their work is subjected to political litmus tests. And all of that means that you really can't do journalism, because journalism is about not adhering to any clique or any fad or any fashion. It's about pursuing the truth even when it's inconvenient. And so I had a choice to make, and it's a choice that I think a lot of other people are going to have to make, not just in journalism, but people that are sort of living inside these institutions that are undergoing this ideological transformation. And it was stay and cling to the prestige and be able to say that I'm Bari Weiss of the New York Times, which you better believe gets people to call you back faster than I'm Bari Weiss of Substack, which gets people to ask, what the fuck is Substack? To stay and have that prestige, but ultimately to become a half version of myself, ultimately to betray my values, ultimately to abandon the reasons that I became a journalist to begin with, which is to tell the truth, to pursue it even when it's inconvenient to the narrative. And so the question of this panel, just to wrap it up, is, I think the question is, can truth survive the new journalism? And I'm actually extremely bullish on that. I believe the truth can absolutely survive. It's going to survive in the new journalism. It's just not going to survive in the old institutions that I think many of us took for granted. I think that it's all about building the new world where the truth can be told. And that's something I hope we'll get to in the Q&A.
Thank you, Bari. Lots and lots to unpick there. I'm really looking forward to it. And last but not least, Mick.
Sorry. Okay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Are you with me? Yes. Okay. Greetings from Northeast London. Some very important points raised by all my esteemed fellow panelists so far. I just want to talk about what I think is the fundamental issue which forms the framework of all of this discussion. And as someone who is not perhaps, I wouldn't say the token man on the panel, but the token old geezer, put it in a little bit of historical perspective. The fundamental issue relating to all of this discussion is basically that free speech, freedom of speech and freedom of the press is fundamentally out of fashion across the media, across social media and across our wider culture. You may have noticed that our half-wit prince, Harry, last week made this speech which got into a lot of trouble when he said that or gave a blog post, I should say, where he said that the First Amendment, the American First Amendment, is bonkers. And Harry, of course, was particularly talking about the part where it says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. That was the particular part of the First Amendment that he thought was bonkers. Established in 1791, for me, that's still the legal gold standard of freedom of the press and of the speech around the world. Not enough, but still the gold standard. But what's seriously bonkers is, despite all of the abusive headlines and social media reaction that he got in some quarters, many people who should know better actually agree with Prince Harry about the First Amendment being bonkers, and actually don't think there should be a right to free speech in that way. He is one privileged white male who gets the freedom to express his opinions without being counted in that respect. In the UK, we are up to our eyes in laws restricting freedom of speech, from libel laws to new privacy laws. And I was told during the debates around the Leveson inquiry here that the idea that we could have an American-style unregulated press was other-planetary. That's what the First Amendment is thought of here. But even in America, I'm very struck by the way in which there are new campaigns for hate speech laws to be introduced. There is the informal censorship that spreads everywhere from the campus to the social media despite the fact the First Amendment still exists. And that even the American Civil Liberties Union no longer defends free speech as an absolute right. So when we talk about the so-called cancel culture today, is it a new phenomenon or is it building on something that's begun? I think that this has been coming a very long time. 30 odd years ago, when I was a young man in my 20s, I set up a magazine called Living Marxism. I was the editor of Living Marxism, and we had a campaign over 30 years ago for the right to be offensive. And that was in response to the furore that surrounded Salman Rushdie's, I'm trying to think what his book was called now for a moment. Satanic Verses. Satanic Verses, thank you. And what we saw as the real failure, or at least the kind of wobbliness of the liberal establishment in defending Rushdie against the abuse and the fatwa that he received. It's over 30 years ago I started that campaign for the right to be offensive. 6 years ago, when I published my book, Trigger Warning, about free speech, I talked then about the culture of you can't say that, or as it's increasingly become, the culture of you can't say that, which is an attempt to narrow and define and censor public discussion. That was in particular in response to the failure of the liberal literary world, intellectual world, to stand forthright with Charlie Hebdo after the massacre in Paris. Despite the original outburst of demonstrations, there were far more questions being asked about whether this offensive Islamophobic publication should be able to exist in that form. So it's been going on a long time, and it's now we have this rampant, and the word has been coined, the phrase has been coined cancel culture, which is the fact that it's taken on so rapidly, I think, indicates there's a problem there, that people want a new language to kind of talk about, that where the president of the United States can be cancelled on social media, anybody can be cancelled across media for saying the wrong thing or being the wrong person expressing a view, that you can't say that as well as you can't say that. There are campaigns that want to cancel parts of the media altogether now, both in Britain and in America. We have a long-standing campaign here called Stop Funding Hate, which is about trying to stop people, stop companies, stop corporations taking out adverts with the Daily Mail or the Sun or newspapers which they disagree. And I noticed that it's just been launched in America, a new alliance of 40 organisations from Black Lives Matter across the environmentalists and other progressive organisations that are doing the same thing, that are pressing corporate advertisers to stop advertising with Fox News for exactly the same reason, that they don't want this voice to actually exist and be funded in the public space. And I think it's very easy and it's right to criticise, you know, a kind of woke generation of people who are trying to take it over, of young journalists who seem to be more interested in projecting their emotions and their identity politics rather than putting forward an argument or pursuing investigative journalism, who seem to believe that truth is something that is known by a few and should be delivered to the rest of us rather than being investigated and debated before we arrive at it, discovered. That's all very well, but I think there's a more fundamental problem, which is how could that possibly happen? And I was very struck by a tweet from a woman called Rita Panahi from the Herald Sun in Australia last year, where she said that cancel culture wouldn't exist without coward culture. Cancel culture wouldn't exist without coward culture. Now, that's actually, there's a lot of truth in that. That it's actually the willingness of the kind of those who are supposed to be the guardians of our liberal culture to literally or metaphorically take the knee and basically give in to these demands that allows this to happen. Now, otherwise, the people who are demanding this from below, the kind of grassroots centres, don't have the power to do it alone, but they're being given into. I think that's really the story that Bari's telling. It's a remarkable story of how the New York Times publishers and editors gave into that demand from other journalists that those articles shouldn't be published or should be taken down. I think that's a really key question. There is no possibility to finish of deciding what we deem to be truth without having proper freedom of speech and open discussion. Without that, we will be left, to go back to my Prince Harry starting point, we will be left with listening to Meghan's truth, as she put it, and no one will be allowed to argue against it because it's an entirely subjectively defined thing. That's it.
Thank you, Mick. And so yeah, the next 20 minutes, I'll be asking some of the panelists questions, and panelists, please feel free to disagree with one another and add or develop to each other's points. But also from the audience, please start to raise your hand, because once we've done this section, then I'm going to be taking questions from you, and please keep your video on. And so my first question is to you, Bari. You kind of mentioned how you were particularly hired in order to broaden the range of perspectives. But then isn't that to some extent a kind of recognition from the institution that there needed to be something that was broadened? So when you felt that you weren't able to do that, was that a pressure from within the institution, or were they capitulating to an external force? What did you find?
That's a great question. It connects with what Mick was saying about sort of the the guardians at the top versus the vocal minority inside the paper, and the way that dynamic plays out at the Times, but literally in any company right now. Like, it's the same story everywhere. And basically it goes like this: the people at the very top are generally, let's say, old school liberals, and I mean that in the sort of like the most capacious sense of that word. Like, they believe in the old value system that I was laying out, but they're cowards. And the reason that they're cowards is a combination of a dynamic that we're just seeing over and over again, which is that they overcorrect based on Twitter mobs, and then those Twitter mobs are amplified by a group of people inside the paper who wield a very powerful weapon, and that's the weapon of the moral cudgel, right? If you're running an institution and you have a group of people inside your organization who could call you a bigot, who could call you a racist, who could ism or phobe you in whatever direction, what's happening again and again and again is sort of the caving to that group. I'll say, by the way, that like, I am not like, if you look at the sort of exodus from the Times over the past, Liz Bruning being the most recent example, me and Liz have quite different politics, but the point is that anyone that sort of doesn't fall in line with the exact tenets of this orthodoxy, they find a way to squeeze that person out. And it's just happening again and again and again. And so it's like the call is coming inside the house. It's not just happening on social media, it's happening inside the paper. And I've thought a lot about, like, going back to what Mick was saying about the sort of dearth of courage. What would happen at one of these institutions? And we saw a good example of this at Trader Joe's. We saw a good example of this at Coinbase. If you simply said, no, if you don't believe in the mission of this organization as it's stated, and you want to make this place into your sort of like platform for your moral preening, this is not the right place for you to work. The problem would be solved pretty rapidly. Another way that I think that you could solve a problem at a place like the New York Times, and I had suggested this to Sulzberger, the publisher, years ago, was what would it look like for the Times to run an experiment where no employee of the New York Times is allowed to use Twitter for the next 6 months? Just 6 months. Let's see what happens. I suspect that it would lead to a self-deportation of people who are basically using the paper as a platform to build their Twitter following rather than to pursue journalism. So I think that there's all kinds of experiments you could run. Coinbase being an example of the head of that organization saying to his, for those who don't know the example, saying to his company, we're not doing politics at work anymore. That's just not what we're doing. And if that's what you want to do, we're going to give you a really, really nice severance package. So that was the dynamic that played out at the Times. And I just know from talking to other journalistic institutions, but really just other companies in general, that it's that same dynamic playing out again and again and again. And it's often breaking down along generational lines, but not always.
Thank you, Bari. And my question to you, Cade, is that you kind of mentioned that you are kind of paying attention to the comments and the criticism, and that's the kind of checks and balances that you're seeing emerge in the kind of new media space. But do you see that as the kind of future of a kind of emergent checks and balances? Because that's really one of the fundamental things that people argue is missing from the kind of new media, the kind of editorial guidance, all of the different people checking your work, and then you also have different people from different perspectives kind of challenging. So is there an emergent checks and balances forming within the new media?
That's an interesting question. What I see happening is, so I was referring there specifically to Substack, and where you have these, sorry, my dog might make an appearance in just a moment. So you have these, you have, like, Bari has this incredibly successful Substack. Her things are all open to the public. But if someone else, if I or Glenn Greenwald or someone wants to write a Substack and make it private so that only funders have access to it, that's a way of immediately cutting off the majority of criticism. So unless screenshots of this thing gets shared, which will probably happen if you have a big enough name, then you're basically selling your product to people who already agree with you. And to me, that's a problem. And as a writer, I sort of love it. My Substack is going to get much less horrible, bad faith criticism than would a piece that I wrote for a national outlet or something that was more open to the public. But that's also problematic, right? To borrow a term, because we need this conversation should be happening beyond echo chambers. And instead what we have is, I'm going to fund the people that I like, or the same thing is true of my podcast. Very few people listen to my podcast. They might hate read my work if it's open and available for the public, but they're not going to listen to my podcast because nobody wants to spend an hour listening to people that they don't like. And so the criticism that I get is normally good faith, is often positive, which I appreciate, but that means that I have sort of insulated myself from criticism that might be valid, but I'm not even hearing it anymore. And I've done things to actually make my echo chamber sort of more impenetrable. So for instance, I only see notifications on Twitter from people who follow me. And I do that for self-preservation, because it is very difficult just to be on Twitter as a journalist and have people constantly telling you that you're a horrible person. But that means that I also lose all of the criticism that could be in good faith from people who don't follow me, because I put up this protective barrier around myself. And so I'm mad at myself for doing this, but I still need to do it because I still need to be able to function on this app. So that's where I see the sort of the echo chambers being growing ever stronger, which is a really serious problem. I mean, I think a couple people have mentioned the 2016 election, and there's a reason that most of the media didn't realize that Donald Trump was going to win, because our echo chambers told us one narrative, and that narrative turned out to be wrong.
One thing I would just add to what Katie said is that the problem of audience capture, like Substack and Patreon, et cetera, have not solved it, right? Like the New York Times, why is it doing what it's doing? Why is Fox doing what it's doing? Easy, because their job is to engage. Now that they don't have to please advertisers, they have to please their readers. And 95% readers of the New York Times are liberals, progressives, and Democrats. So their job is to just give them the heroin hit that they want. Same job at Fox, but in a different direction. And I have found like the pull, right, to do that exact same thing on my Substack. I know that if I run like an anti-woke expose about X, Y, and Z, I'm just gonna the numbers are gonna be through the roof. It's literally gonna put more money in my pocket. And so how do you resist the pull to create that, to not replicate the same problems that are happening in the mainstream? That, that was like one of the reasons that I left. I don't have the answer yet to how to solve that problem, but I just want to echo the fact that like we're captive to the same forces, and in a way it's more intimate, right? Because like you really know your audience, because there's much less of them also.
And you can see your income decline if you say something that pisses off your audience. You can see in real time as people are voting with their wallets, which can be incredibly stressful. I deal with that by hardly at all paying attention. We have a Patreon for my podcast, and I don't even have access to it, so I can't read the comments. I don't read our Reddit page. I don't read the reviews. I try to really insulate myself from that criticism, because I don't want my perspective to be skewed by our audience. Because we've seen this happen to other people. There's some examples that I won't name, but audience capture is certainly a real problem.
And continuing on with that theme, Helen, what role do you feel like social media plays in this question? You mentioned a lot of the economic factors. So I feel like social media also has changed the kind of economic incentives now to pursue clicks, but also social media seems to also be increasing kind of threats from female journalists, whether they may get abuse and things like that, which might contribute to censorship. So what role would you say social media plays in the way in which journalism has now been changing?
I mean, I think it's been very bad for journalism in the sense that it's often bad when you can see what other people are looking at. And making that transparent has changed how journalists think about their stories. Like Katie and Bari have been saying, like, in the same way, for them, it's very direct and financial, but for every journalist now, there will be analytics. You will be able to go and look. And every journalist knows, I can go and write a long reported piece with doing loads of shoe leather reporting that is really, about something like domestic violence, incredibly important subject. And it will not be read as much as my like, hey, who else on the internet is a dick piece that I bashed out in 30 angry minutes, right? And it's fundamentally, kind of soul destroying. So there's that level of what social media does to you, just having that level of information. But the same thing, I mean, I think Mick mentioned Trump's tweets. It was astonishing. I think the day that kind of Trump wasn't president anymore was the day that he came off Twitter, because what had happened was that was the kind of journalist pub, like, or bar, right, where everybody hang out, and just having his stuff shoved in the face all the time. It was like the bit in Up, you know, the dog that kind of goes squirrel. Like, it was just having a perfectly normal day, and then Donald Trump would just kind of drop a steaming tweet onto Twitter, and everyone would feel obligated to suddenly pay attention to it. And that was a kind of, I mean, Twitter is just, Rob Brydon once described it to me as a megaphone for lunatics. And I think that's the point, is it's been a very effective way of kind of culture jacking, like jamming the signal, basically, and trying to work out what's actually happening and what's 300 people on Twitter has become harder and harder. And I do think it has a particular, both for people from ethnic minorities and for women, because I do think that people make much more snap judgments, and you do get much more blowback on stuff. There's quite good research on that. I think, you know, gender, which is the one that I come into trouble with more, it's really funny to me to see male journalists write stuff that is far more inflammatory than anything I've written, and they just cannot get a hate mob going at all, because there's a kind of great deal of burn the witch about it. But also that kind of gestures to something slightly more that's harder to talk about, which is about kind of inter-feminist beef, right? And I think what did for Bari at the New York Times is the idea that other people thought they should have her job. Why she got that job and not me? Oh, there goes Moose. And like, once you're on Substack, you're not a competitor in the same way. And so much of this kind of inter-journalist cancellation, whether it's journalists, whether it's in academia, whether it's in the arts, is often really driven by something just pretty much as base as jealousy. And like, you shouldn't have that job. You don't deserve that job. If I lop you off at the knees, then maybe I or someone who's on my team can have that job. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I think social media is a part of it. But I also think, yeah, competition is a part of it, and economics are a huge part of it too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Helen. And last question to you, Mick, before we start taking questions from the audience. You mentioned things that were even decades ago, such as the Salman Rushdie affair. So do you see what's going on right now as something new? Is there anything new about this phenomenon, or is this just another manifestation of a very long problem?
No, I think it is new, but it's a problem that's been long in the making. And it's now reaching a really intensive head, and social media has absolutely acted as a catalyst for speeding that up. It's allowed people to do things they couldn't have done before. But I think the fundamentals of the loss of faith in freedom of speech is something that's been deteriorating. It's been getting worse over the last 30 years. And I was also, as it happens, I was very struck by Bari saying she was an intellectual diversity hire. I was that at the Times as well. I was the editor of Living Marxism magazine when the Times hired me to be economist. I don't think that's going to happen now in 2021. But I do think it's an ongoing problem. But it's been something that's been made. It's been brought to the surface, as I say, and accelerated and catalysed by the impact of social media. And one of the things that social media really does, which Helen was just talking about, is the huge gap it's created. It exposes between the literary, cultural, journalistic world and the rest of the world. I mean, one of the striking things about Twitter in the UK is that every vote in the last 10 years, you would have imagined, if you were reading Twitter, would have gone the other way than it did. The proportional representation vote in the UK, the Scottish independence referendum, overwhelmingly the Brexit referendum and the general elections, you would have imagined would have gone the opposite way to what they did if you'd have believed what was being said on social media. So that kind of hedging in a world where people, and I think the same thing happened in the States in 2016, most strikingly, the hedging in of the opinion, and then you've got to find some excuse for why that happened. So then you have this whole narrative which started about fake news. It's fake news, it's misinformation, and all of these things are really demonstrating, which I think is a fundamental problem with journalism and its social media expressions particularly, the kind of disdain for the mass of non-Twittering people, that the only reason people could have voted that way in 2016, either in the Brexit referendum or in the American election or in any of these other things, must be because they've been misled in some way by fake news, by misinformation, by Russians paying for tweeters. And you can understand the trauma that certain people in journalism had when they would realise that they were completely wrong in terms of their calling of public opinion. But I think that's all that's another very dangerous element of this, which is the kind of contempt which is demonstrated for the mass of people by a certain kind of elite echo chamber kind of journalism that I think we need to, which again has been brewing up for a long time and has come to a head over the last few years.
Thank you, Mick. So we've got lots of people with their hands up, and we'll take questions from the audience now. The first question from Hal, please. Oh, unmute yourself.
Sorry. No, my main question is about, okay, so almost like two problems here. We have a crisis of the public sphere whereby people don't have this common set or common ground of truth. So the New York Times maybe used pride of basis where maybe you don't agree with everything in the opinion section, but you all maybe agreed on the facts in the news section. That's disintegrated, but what's also disintegrated is the allowance of certain acceptable opinions. What's a bigger challenge and what is more dangerous?
Yeah, we'll take a few questions before we come back. Next question from Dylan, please.
Hi. My question for all the panelists is, well, people often refer to something like the Fair Broadcasting Act for TV back in like 1987 or whenever that was ended as something like the end of like the golden age of journalism, where people prioritized truth and institutions were expected to be unbiased. But I'm wondering now if this is something that we can expect government to resolve through some kind of similar policy, or if this is something that has to be resolved through private institutions or groups like this one.
Thank you, Dylan. Anastasia?
Yeah. Thanks for everyone for coming. It's really interesting to hear everyone's insights into this question. My question, we talked a little bit about how we might, how institutions might move on from this. And I know we've just spoken about, the issues of Twitter. And I think that for me, it definitely is a kind of a biased sample of people. You end up with very dominant, personalities being overrepresented. In comparison to, if journalists went out into communities and spoke, you could get more of a normal distribution. I wonder what you thought, if it was another solution to this might be, blocking the website in the office, or saying that you can't reference tweets within your article.
Zara?
I'm just going to start off by saying a really big thank you to Mick Hume. You're a personal hero of mine. I read your book, Trigger Warning, when I was 16 or 17, and I'm 23 years old right now. And I didn't know what I believed back when I read it, but thank God I read your book, because I truly believe in free speech, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. I'm also starting the NCTJ diploma in October, and I think I'm interested in data journalism because it kind of skews away from all of this social justice stuff, and I think I'm good with numbers. So my question to everybody on the panel is, the situation seems really dismal, and like Bari said, you kind of have to compromise on being a half version of yourself. What kind of advice would you give to aspiring journalists that don't want to compromise on who they are? Where do they go? Where could they pursue true journalism?
Thank you, Zara. So does anyone from the panel want to pick up on anything, this idea of kind of the breakdown of consensus reality, the role of social media, and any advice for an aspiring journalist? Helen, do you want to go first?
I was going to say, well, how about I make myself really popular by saying, we're talking about the kind of the fairness doctrine, that we're very lucky in Britain to have the BBC. If you look at NPR, publicly funded radio in America, and the range of opinions that it offers, there's like a tiny fragment of the spectrum that the BBC is obliged, by law and by regulation to offer. And it is really vital that we have a public space in which people from, Novara Media and the Institute of Economic Affairs are forced to sit on a sofa next to each other and acknowledge that you can have that divergent range of opinions without one person either being a kind of Nazi or the reincarnation of Stalin. So I think we're really lucky here. I don't know how you get back to that situation in America, honestly, because it is a country which is extremely resistant to big public funding works projects, anything that kind of smacks of socialism. So that's quite tough. And to Zara about compromising in journalism, I think you have to, I hope everyone on the panel will agree that you do have to make compromises in journalism. It's the question is which ones you make. So often you will, if you want to pursue a really niche topic, then you can become a brilliant specialist at it, but you have to acknowledge that, you will never be read by millions of people. Ditto, if you want to do reporting that's very different to opinion journalism, you might want to go and work at an outfit that is kind of completely in tune with your views, but you might have to sacrifice reach to do that, or vice versa. So it's about deciding where your own personal limits are, and I think it's really good to go and work for places that aren't in the same ideological zone as you are. I mean, I spent 5 years at the beginning of my career working at the Daily Mail, which is a right-wing newspaper, and then I went to the New Statesman, which is a left-wing magazine, and that was really useful to see both sides of two very different organizations and to see how they function. So I think don't be too prescriptive about what you will and won't put up with at the start of your career, because you need to learn and set those boundaries for yourself.
Thank you, Helen.
I would say, to respond to the great question about like the big question, right? The epistemic crisis and how do we know what truth is? We could talk about that for hours. It would be really fun to talk about that over a joint, because it sounds like it's like a 20-year-old stoner conversation, but it is the conversation. It is the root of all of this. The book I would recommend to everyone to read, order it now, is called The Revolt of the Public by Martin Gurri, who explains the phenomenon that we are living through and this crisis better than absolutely anyone else. It's published by Stripe Press, which is another interesting sort of new venture coming out of San Francisco. So I'd really recommend that to that smart question. I forget who asked it. As for journalism, look, first of all, ask yourself, is there something else that I could do that I would be really happy doing and that would be a lot more lucrative and wouldn't require me to go online and become a punching bag? So that's the first thing. But if you're really committed to it, and God love you, I understand it because I was too, and remain that way. I think there's going to be an interesting rebundling that's going to happen. Here's what I mean by that. And I'm suggesting this only because maybe by the time you finish your degree, there will be new institutions for you to be a part of. Right now, for the consumer, if you want to go and seek out independent-minded, heterodox journalism, you have to spend a lot of money. You need to subscribe to like 8 different Substacks and support some Patreons and listen to like 8 different podcasts. If you're like a dentist or an accountant or a lawyer, you're not going to do that. So like, I see that as a major market problem to be solved. What would it look like if there was one place that you went to that kind of syndicated all of those voices? That's where I think this is going. Like, I think we're at the sort of very, very, very beginning of, and it's almost like the same thing if you look at the streamers, right? Why do I need to subscribe to like Paramount Plus to watch the Oprah Meghan Markle interview, which took me at like 2 hours to download, and Hulu and Netflix? Someone's going to solve that problem. I think that's what's going to happen in this independent space. And I think that's going to be extremely exciting to watch, to see how that's going to work, how there could become kind of like a federation of the independent-minded journalism that's out there. And maybe you, I think it was Zara, would be, the data journalist in that new world. But that's sort of where I see the future in the next, few years, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, Bari, my question about that is whether or not actually the tendency is really towards monopolies or oligopolies, right? So, I mean, one of the problems I think that the New York Times has is it's just too big. Like, if you have a newsroom that big, no wonder you end up with fiefdoms and like people are at war with the kind of, other bit of the newsroom. Smaller places where I've worked, you have to sit in the room with people you disagree with, which when it's, I was kind of stunned when I found out that there's a special like problematics editor on the masthead at the New York Times who edits the people who are seen as being like a bit,
my wife. Yeah.
Well, I know, I was going to say Nelly's one of them, right? And that to me is kind of like fascinating and hilarious that has to be kind of hived off. But that's a kind of something that can only happen in a newsroom of 1,000 people. And my worry about that is that it wouldn't matter if, Twitter consumed journalist attention if there were 5 other things that were a bit like Twitter. It wouldn't matter if the New York Times had a very strong ideological, liberal position if there were like 5 other New York Timeses. And actually, maybe the time has come to talk about media ownership and decentralization, and that's something that people have been really resistant to. The problem with Facebook is fundamentally no more or less than the fact that there's only Facebook that is Facebook sized. And that's one of the things, again, if you get cancelled by, the Scotsman newspaper, that's not a problem, right? If you get cancelled by the only game in town, that becomes a problem. And that's where all of this comes back to economics.
Yeah, because in a way, if you're, we all know that Facebook, Twitter, the New York Times, they all have the same position. So if you're booted off of, one of those platforms, chances are you're going to get terrible coverage in another and probably get kicked off another. And it's all going to, basically what's going to happen is the modern digital version of ostracism. Yeah. That's the world we're living in. And yeah, I agree with you. I wrote a column about this recently about big tech because I needed to understand it for myself. And I think the person that I'd recommend to everyone on this issue is a venture capitalist called David Sachs, who writes amazingly about the way the First Amendment has been euthanized as the town square moved onto the digital space. Yeah. And that most people really don't appreciate how thoroughly that has happened. And he suggests some way forward about what we're going to do about it. But yeah, Helen, I really agree with you.
Mick, did you want to...
just a couple of things. Disagree with Helen about something and agree with her about something else. On the BBC, I fundamentally disagree with her. I find the BBC absolutely unwatchable. It is like the voice of establishment conformism now, even worse than it was in the old days. If you look at its coverage as the kind of pioneer or the kind of front runner of the mainstream media during the Brexit debate, it was just dreadful and was completely caught out by the results. Great vision of the BBC presenters on referendum night, shocked to discover that they'd lost. And if you look at their coverage during COVID, I think has been even worse, as the kind of spokesperson of the government's politics of fear. It really reminded me that when it's slightly ironic that the BBC have that great quote from Orwell outside Broadcasting House now about if liberty means anything, it means the freedom to tell people what they don't want to hear, which I completely agree with. But Orwell said that his depiction of the Ministry of Truth in 1984 was based on his experience of working for the BBC during the Second World War. And I was kind of reminded of that every time I was forced to watch the BBC's COVID coverage. So I disagree with you about that. But what I do agree with you about the journalism thing, about everybody makes compromises, but the question is, which compromise are you prepared to make? And I think fundamentally, don't work for anybody who expects you to put your name to something you know not to be true. That's my kind of absolute baseline for decent journalism. Now, when I run writing schools to young people who are interested in journalism now, I tell them what I think are the principles of how to write. And then I say to them, as to how you make money out of it, how you make a living out of it, that's your problem, because it's a very difficult issue. There are definitely fewer opportunities of the old school career, start off reporting on the courts for the local paper, then end up at national media. Oh, it does still happen. But at the same time, there are all these new opportunities that exist in new media, in the social media, in people starting up things. We started up Spiked. All of the panelists here are involved in new ventures, which mean the door is open in a way that it wasn't in the past. And there's no need to panic too much about the fact that the kind of the road to the Sunday Times might not be as straight as you once hoped it would be. Just one last point about Facebook and social media, about cancelling. I really agree with Helen again there about the power of being cancelled by Facebook and what that can mean. And that's what makes it so astonishing to me, that you have these coalitions of apparently or self-styled progressive organisations, like on the green issue, for example, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and actually lobbying Facebook and demanding that they take down more content, that they take down anything which is considered to be climate denial, or whatever the latest phrase is for that. Actually demanding that the billionaires of Silicon Valley take more control over what we can and can't say on social media. That for me is a really shocking kind of collapse of what liberalism ought to mean.
Thank you, Mick. Katie, did you want to pick up on anything?
Yeah, really interesting questions. A few things. First of all, with the fairness doctrine, I don't think that that rebirthing the fairness doctrine would solve anything, because in the U.S. it only would impact the public airwaves, and so this would mean that, you know, Fox News, MSNBC, these hyper-partisan outlets wouldn't be impacted at all. I also think there's some free speech issues, you know, with the government telling you that you have to present both sides of an argument. So I have some sort of, I don't know, fuzzy feelings about that. In terms of social media, one of the problems with the reporting, the economy of reporting right now, is just at the Stranger, for instance. So when I was on staff there, I had between 2 and 3 deadlines a day. And we had a small staff. The staff was probably a fourth of what it had been in, you know, the paper's heyday, when before Google and Craigslist and Facebook scooped up all the ad money. So we had a really small staff trying to cover the city. And if you have 2 or 3 deadlines a day, you're not doing thorough work. And you don't even have time to call people. You don't have time to go out in the community and make contacts and find out what's happening around you. What you have time to do is look at social media. And social media is not a good reflection of what the world actually is. And so I was totally guilty of this. If you are reporting by social media, you are not getting a good perspective. But it's easy to do and it's cheap to do. And if you're, you know, if you're paying people very little money and demanding a lot of them, that's what you're going to get. Another point about the economics of reporting right now is, I'm not sure how this is played out in the UK, but in the US, there are very few local papers anymore. And they've all been scooped up by the same handful of giant conglomerates who really don't give a shit about their product. It seems like it's just about making money. They hollow out these local papers, and then they just, everything is farmed out into like USA Today and Gannett and these other conglomerates. And so there's no bench, right? There's no, if I knew I wanted to be a reporter in high school, would I have been able to get an internship at my local paper? No, because there was no local paper. And so not only are local communities not being covered by people in the community, so there's nobody at the school board meetings, there's nobody at the city council meetings, which has a major impact on how these governments are run. But also you don't have this deep bench where you have young reporters who get really good at a beat and then move up to a regional reporter, and then maybe at the top of their career they would end up at the New York Times or something like that. The best of the best ending up in those places. Instead, what you have is, you know, people going to Columbia Journalism School or NYU, and then immediately going to sort of maybe these bloggy, sort of high voicey digital outlets, or going into these national papers. And so it's much more about building a brand as a journalist and having lots of followers. That's how you get jobs. It's much less about your clips covering the local courts or the school board or the police or whatever it is. And so, like, our closest equivalent to the BBC, NPR, I worked in public radio for a little while. Public radio is doing a lot to diversify their staff, and they've done really, I think, quite a good job, considering that public radio has historically been a very, you know, white industry. What they're not doing is hiring people outside of Columbia Journalism School and NYU, and people who go to state schools, or maybe who didn't go to college at all. They're not hiring poor people. They're not hiring conservatives. So you might have lots of racial diversity, and people might be represented from all 47 genders, but you might not have any poor people within the newsroom, or nobody who went to a state school. And so that's not really diversity. That's diversity of, you know, one cohort at NYU. And so these problems are structural, and to get them to change, well, for one thing, and this has changed somewhat, for the longest time, media internships didn't pay. And so the only way to get a career in media was to go work for free in New York for a year. And who can do that? Only people who can afford to live in New York for free for a year. And these things are changing somewhat. There's been much more incentive to pay interns, but still, I don't think most of these outlets are recruiting people from, you know, the shitty state school down the street, as opposed to the upper echelon of elite institutions.
Thank you, Katie. We've got lots of questions. So please keep your questions short, so we can take as many as possible. Ewan?
Hi, my question was just about solving the issue. I was wondering which you think would be more important, regulation from governments or bodies, or just a cultural shift? If I could give an example, the current higher education bill has been criticized and celebrated on different sides in the UK. some people saying it's great for freedom of speech, but also other people saying that regulation limits topics even being breached in the first place. So I was wondering what your perspective on the balance would be.
Sienna?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a freelance writer and fellow heretic, so it's such a pleasure to be here. I'd like to speak about oppression just for a bit and then end with a few questions. So oppression is relative, and I often hear that when an oppressed group is speaking, then we must listen. Well, okay, by that logic, then Thomas Sowell deserves the same respect as Ibram X. Kendi. Detransitioners should have just as much safety and freedom to tell their stories as other trans people do. And any woman should have the freedom and safety she needs to speak about feminism without being labeled a TERF. Sadly, what we are seeing is like widespread emotional abuse. The cycle is so clear. And it is triggering for women who are keen on setting certain boundaries in women's spaces, such as domestic violence shelters. So I worry about losing the thread of logic collectively and what that could do to our collective safety and freedom. The people who agree with, I think, just essentially that free speech matters and that it's at risk, people who agree with us, I would say, believe in upholding freedom, whereas the people who disagree and create an environment where perhaps some of our livelihoods could be at risk seem to believe that they have every right to tear down the rights of others for the sake of the rights they believe they are entitled to. So that's just my little manifesto. And now my questions are for Bari, if you'd like, or for any of you who have thoughts on this. Bari, I love hearing you speak time and time again about the people who are the new world builders. I've heard you say this on Clubhouse, and I love that. So my question to you and to all of you is, do you think it's possible to build bridges with people who are so dogmatic in their thinking? Is it worth the effort? And could it be more productive to invest all of your energy in spaces and with people who are more free in their thinking and in their actions? And how do you avoid creating an echo chamber? And lastly, around the issue of gender, what are you finding is a successful, expansive way of opening up the conversation while asserting truth and science?
Thank you, Sienna. Beth K.
Hi guys. So as you've all said, social media has obviously been a huge driving factor in shaping public attitude to freedom of speech. So what I'd like to know is, kind of following on from Ewan's question, is what role or duty do the panelists feel that education institutions have in informing that public attitude? And what do you guys think of the idea of a free speech champion, i.e. someone responsible for sanctioning those that are judged to have been no platforming speakers over their views?
Yeah, that's a UK government recent announcement. Moshe Foreman.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I wanted to just ask on a more kind of personal level, Bari, and maybe Katie as well, about your experience of the sort of the hatred that you had to deal with. Because the one thing that really kind of shocks me continually about the whole of the cancel culture, whether it's in journalism or elsewhere, is the sheer cruelty of the whole thing. The lack of ability to show any empathy, the total inability to ever forgive anybody for their crimes. But normally, like this happens over social media, right? It happens on Twitter, where you get the most appalling sort of hate spewed out, the cancelling, all these terrible things. But Bari, you, and I don't know if it happened to you, Katie, as well, you actually were working with these people that were doing this to you, right? You were working in a newsroom, you were working in a place of employment, and until you left, these weren't anonymous people on Twitter. These were people maybe you met them by the coffee machine every day. And I'm interested in a kind of more personal, human level of how you dealt with that. And how also do you explain it? And was the hatred actually in person the same as what they were writing on Twitter?
Okay, thank you. So we've only got 15 minutes left, so please really short, sharp questions so that we can get them answered. Mike, stop, continues.
Hi. So I wanted to know, you guys presented two different views about like which direction media should go, either like a new sort of new big organizations or remaining decentralized. There's pros and cons of both, but like, is there a way to split the difference between those two? Is there some sort of like middle ground where you as journalists would want to contribute work, but where, but some way that would, be profitable for, and engage audiences?
Thank you. And Callum Bernard.
Hiya. Alluding to the point made at the start about guardians at the top and them being cowards, I'm interested in knowing whether there's what kind of percentages of the rank and file people in these institutions are true believers in these ideas, or themselves cowards who are just towing a line to a really, really small amount of people who are just the most vocal.
Thank you, Callum. Daniel Sharp.
Hi there, thanks. I've just got a quick question and a quick suggestion. My question is to Helen, since you mentioned at the start, and we've not really discussed it, the problem with rich people, with Russian oligarchs, with Putin's oligarchs suing journalists who are pursuing truth. I think Nick Cohen wrote a really good article about that recently. So what on that level, what do we do about it? And my suggestion, following on from Bari, is you suggested like a sort of syndicate, a sort of federation for the future. So my suggestion is, we've got a lot of international media people here, so there's a project for you guys. You should do it.
Nilu?
Hi, my question is for Bari or any of the panelists that want to answer. Bari said how their grandparents saw the New York Times as almost like biblical. This is where people went to for their information. And now that we've seen the rise in secularism, which I always interpreted as being everyone kind of practicing the religion, it's kind of become everyone not practicing any religion. Do you think that these institutions have a sense of godlike power, and that's why they're not willing to let go of any of it?
Thank you, Lily. And then we'll take one more question and then go back to the speakers. Luke?
Thanks, Inaya. I did have a different question, but Helen, I had to pick you up on the BBC comment. You said we're lucky to have the BBC. I just want to ask a quick question about that, because obviously historically I would have agreed with you, but I think we can quite fairly accuse the BBC of doing similar things of what we've heard from Bari, of the New York Times have done. They're obviously interested in diversity, but maybe less and less interested in the only sort of diversity that I think matters, and that's diversity of opinion, diversity of thought. It seems to be becoming more woke. I won't say left or right bias, but certainly liberal middle class bias. And I'd argue that's even more of a big problem for something like the BBC, because they're publicly funded. We don't have a choice whether we pay for the BBC or not. Whereas for an organisation like the New York Times, at least their customers are paying for what they get, regardless of how much we disagree with it. So doesn't the BBC have even more of an ethical responsibility to be as straight down the line and striving for objectivity as possible, rather than pushing an ideological agenda?
Thanks, Luke. Bari, do you want to go first to pick up on anything?
Sure. God, there's so much there. So many thoughtful questions. To Moshe's question about the intimate question about like dealing with hatred, or, was very, I mean, there were people that I sat 2 desks away from who would never say hello to me, even when we were like in the bathroom alone, and, who would subtweet really cruel things about me from 2 desks away, while their spouses would just call me out by name. So it was really really hard. Like I'm not, there's nothing else to say about it other than it was hard. And I can't even imagine how much harder that would be if you're a 22 or a 23-year-old at the start of your career. I think the thing that's most damaging about it is that it makes you scared of your own shadow. It makes you scared that, you know, any little tiny misstep, that, you know, any, you know, poorly constructed sentence in a conversation like this could lead to your ruination. And I just don't think that that is an atmosphere that leads to risk-taking or pushing boundaries. And those are things that I think are essential in journalism or really any endeavor where you're trying to pursue the truth, because sometimes, you know, because that involves oftentimes bucking institutions and bucking the received wisdom. So for me, one of the things that made it really untenable was that aspect of it. And I knew that in order to kind of be able to have, you know, to not, like, that being in an abusive environment essentially was not going to be good for me as a person, and certainly wasn't going to be good ultimately for my career, because I knew that, you know, all of the incentives were just say the safe thing. That way you'll be popular, and people are not popular, but that way you'll be a little less hated, and things will go better for you. And I just knew that that wasn't a path that I wanted to go down. So I have to say, I really haven't regretted leaving for a single moment. I mean, the other thing I would say is just the more that you have a full and happy personal life and a community of people that support you and believe in you, like that really and especially people, you know, the few people that you really admire in the world that are supporting you, that those voices for me have genuinely drowned out the noise online. I've also learned how to be more hygienic about like not looking obsessively at the comments. So that's one thing I would say. The question about Sienna, about building bridges into people that have sort of been subsumed by this ideology. Look, I will say I've spent a lot of time on what I term like hand-to-hand combat. And I would say that I've landed at a place where I just don't feel like that's the best use of my time. I think the best use of my time is the way that I think about it is this. You know, you can stand on the beach and try and push back against a tsunami, but you're just going to keep getting pummeled by the wave again and again and again and again. And frankly, the downstream effects of it on young people like you guys who are looking out into the world and thinking like, I wanted to go into journalism, but holy shit, look what's happening to that person. Why would I possibly want to withstand that? I think the better strategy as a broad principle is stop trying to like fight a tsunami, you know, walk down the beach and start a different party and make that party much more joyful and exciting and attractive and provocative and frankly countercultural. And that will draw people in. And that will even draw in some of the people who are sort of on the fence of being true believers or sort of going along with the flow. Which brings me to the last question of this group that I'll answer, which is what percentage of people are true believers, which is a really excellent question. I think it's the vast majority are not true believers, but the vast majority are also people that have a mortgage to pay and maybe, you know, kids to support, and they're, you know, 40 years old and they've been in their career for a while, and, you know, they look out into the broader landscape of this industry and they think, you know, oh my God, if I stand up against this, how am I going to support my family? And more than that, if all of these old institutions are subsumed by this ideology, who's going to hire me if I stand up against this? So I think that there's just an enormous amount of pressure. And I know these people. I mean, these are the number of closeted people inside institutions who write me weekly to say, like, can you believe what's happening? It's like, yes, I can believe it. But also I understand why they're in the closet. And the whole thing is by building new alternatives, it makes their ability to voice their dissent inside those old institutions easier, because they know that if they get pushed out, there's an actual alternative for them. So I would say it is really a vocal minority, but the majority of people are sort of going along with it because there's not a lot of incentive right now to stand against it.
Thank you, Bari. Helen?
Yeah, sort of like a pick and mix of a million questions. On universities, there was a report, which I'm sure some of you have seen, from Essex University yesterday about the no platforming of a couple of gender critical academics, which I thought was a really good model, bits of it that weren't redacted anyway, because it said basically that the university had become obsessed with becoming a Stonewall diversity champion and had therefore bought in at one charity's idea of what the law was, which was incorrect as it turned out, and had basically intruded in the free speech rights and then unfairly smeared these two academics, basically in the pursuit of, conforming to an outsider's agenda, and the university should have its own policies. And I think that's what it comes down to me. I'm not keen on the government getting involved. Like, the government getting involved in one direction or the other in universities is never really a good thing. But what universities should do is not buy in their policy platforms from other people. They should make rules themselves, and they should ensure that they're balanced and that diversity and inclusion are balanced with the right to academic free debate and freedom of speech. So I think that's really important. And I say that is I think that was a real cause for happiness yesterday. I thought we're all contrarians here, so I'll defend the BBC. That'll go down well. But I mean, there is a point there, which I think Mick alluded to earlier, that the BBC has always been pro-establishment. And you'd sort of say, oh, the BBC's got worse in recent years. I mean, in the 50s, the BBC was like 12 guys who'd been to the same university, all sitting in a room deciding its programmes together. Like, there is no halcyon time when the BBC was a forum for diversity of thought in that sense. It does undoubtedly have problems with particularly class and regionality. But at the same time, I think it is something really precious. Like, when I first started doing daily politics, Sunday politics actually, the presenter on that was Andrew Neil, big Brexit supporter, owner of the Spectator, chairman of the Spectator, right-wing media magazine, and the programme editor was Robbie Gibb, who then went to work for Theresa May, a Conservative Prime Minister, and then was involved in setting up GB News early on and has now pulled out. But that was not a knee-jerk lefty liberal programme. And I thought, you were just not getting that in the other direction. You're not having kind of equivalent, leftists involved in stuff. And so, that was really important to me. And I think we're also lucky in this country to have a big counterweight in the form of lots and lots of right-wing newspapers to any perceived liberal bias in the BBC. It is just simply not the case that there is the BBC's version of reality and no one gets to counter that. So that's my qualified criticism of the BBC. And then the thing about Russian oligarchs, well, one of the big problems that seems to be that it'll delight Mick, because Brexit, I think, really could help with this. Why are our courts being used by non-British residents who have no intention of coming over here, who have no intention of, if they lose and have to pay costs, ever kind of coming up here and stumping out? Why are we a tourist destination for some of, the world's least appealing people to come and use our court system? And that is something that we could absolutely look at in the future now.
Thank you, Helen. Mick?
Yes, first of all, I really endorse Barry's remarks about the waste of time trying to build bridges with people who just want to blow them up and drown you. And you're far better off ploughing your own furrow, and it's making sure your voice is heard. And that difficulty of walking on eggshells when you're trying to work with people is very real. On the question about oligarchs and libel law, I think this is we should remember that whilst we're discussing mainly tonight the new kind of informal forms of restrictions on discussion, there are still old-fashioned legal restrictions, and British libel law has always been the worst in the civilized world. I know this from personal experience, having been personally almost bankrupted by it 20 years ago. It was changed a few years ago to make it supposedly slightly less friendly to libel tourists, but it's still possible for them to do it. And I think compared to the American system, where because of the New York Times, when the New York Times was a different kind of newspaper, Sullivan decision from 1965, it's basically impossible to sue a public figure for libel. For a public figure to sue for libel in America, unless they can prove that there's malice involved in it, is a far better model and would solve a lot of these problems. But even then, the law is continually being reinvented to cast new shadows over free expression and freedom of the press. So, for example, in Britain now, where libel law has always been a big issue, we now have privacy law being invented by judges, never been passed by Parliament, but being invented by judges as a new restriction on freedom of the press. And in America too, privacy is now being used as a new way of attacking press, both the traditional press and the new press online. Personally, I'm all in favour of privacy. I'm entirely against privacy laws. I think they're a very different two very different kettles of fish. And that comes back to Helen's point about, you know, we should be lobbying and pressing government to change the laws in these respects where it affects freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And that's why I'm not a great enthusiast for the idea of a government-appointed free speech czar in our universities. I think there's more of a cultural than a legal problem that needs to be addressed in universities to create and recreate the spirit of academic freedom as part of freedom of speech.
And Katie, anything you wanted to pick up on?
Sure. Just briefly, to Moshe's question about the sort of emotional impact of being basically despised by your colleagues for what you believe, rather than the fact that you, I don't know, cook fish in the break room or whatever. My experience was very trying at The Stranger. I was not liked by my colleagues. It was almost a generational divide where everybody over the age of 40 thought I was great and everybody under 40 thought I was literally Hitler. It was difficult. Like Bari, I found that having, you know, my real life relationships were incredibly important. But after everything that happened, what I found was that I changed, and I think I really changed for the better. I became compassionate and empathetic. And before my own cancellation, I wouldn't have been a canceller. I've always been sort of contrarian, whether I want to admit it or not. But I was much more of a knee-jerk liberal, and I judged people more than ideas. And so if somebody who I knew to be bad or I knew to be conservative, which in my thinking was the same thing, I could discount what they're saying. And then when I was, you know, pegged as not just conservative, but a literal Nazi or whatever, it changed me. It changed me in this one fundamental way where now I no longer look at who's making the argument. I look at the argument itself. And there are some sort of dangers there, you know. I think we have to be careful not to assume that every allegation against every person is incorrect just because it's coming online. And for those of us who've been in the middle of these pile-ons, that can be skewing as well. But for me, I found the experience to be, in the time, sort of acutely difficult, but 4 years out, to be one of the best things that's ever happened to me. I don't get invited to many weddings anymore, but I don't like going to weddings anyway, so that's fine. I
think actually I would really echo that. I think I had the same experience of Katie, that actually being ostracized is somehow, it's a good check on laziness, right? Because you no longer have a tribe, you no longer have your people, and they applaud everything that you do and you applaud everything that they do, and it's all very cozy. Like, being an outsider is fundamentally a good condition for a journalist to be in, and I think that is really important. So, you know, and also whoever assumed that journalism was supposed to be easy, right? You know, it's the whole point of it is you're the emperor the little boy pointing at the emperor going, I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but I can see this guy's penis. And that's, you know, that is literally the point of journalists. You're not there to be popular, you're there to do a useful democratic function. And everyone's been doing book recommendations, so let me finish with mine, which is Alice Drager's brilliant book, Galileo's Middle Finger, which is all about scientific heretics. So it covers gender, it also covers a tribe that all anthropologists tried to claim were incredibly peaceful, and it was terribly offensive to say that we're murdering each other before Westerns had arrived. And it's a couple of years old now, but it so happily predates all of the controversies that we've been talking about tonight. I think it's wonderful.
Thank you. And on that note, we have come to an end. This has been a really, really fantastic discussion. Thank you so much to our amazing speakers. It's been so interesting, so much to chew on. Thank you, everybody, for coming. As I said in the beginning, please consider donating to the Free Speech Champions Project. Also, if you are a young person, either a student or in school, and want to stand up for free speech, consider becoming a free speech champion. And regardless of whatever field you're in or how old you are, also consider joining the Free Speech Network. And I feel like just as there's kind of traditional forms, but spaces like this and how we kind of collaborate collectively to kind of expand the boundaries is just as important in kind of shifting the culture. So thank you so much, everyone. And our evening has come to an end. So I hope you all have a really great rest of your evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.